All right, welcome to the Big Muddy Speaker Series, volume number 4,700 and however many. We have Jim Ogle from Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, which is a huge area, and Jim will explain to us what that actually is. And it does include the town of Quindaro, which is one of the first river towns here in the Kansas City area. And Jim is going to talk about that too. So tonight we have the Executive Director of Freedom's Frontier, Jim Ogle.
Thank you, Larry. I do appreciate it. In fact, spent the last 90 minutes sitting in the green room, eating fried pickles and the delicious special tonight and having good conversation with many of you. And as it approached 7 o'clock, I was wondering when we'd be coming in here so we could listen to the speaker. And then I realized, of course, now it's time to pay for my supper. So thank you for that, Larry. And we'll get going. It is a pleasure for me to present as part of the Big Muddy Speaker Series today. My presentation will focus on the rise and fall of the community of Quindaro, the first free port along the Missouri River from its mouth down by St. Louis. I'll endeavor to show you some of the remarkable history associated with the Quindaro Township site. I also want to share with you what my organization, Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, is doing to work with its partners to let the nation and the world know about the importance of Quindaro. So I need you to get up with me and take this journey together. Let's all load up in our van outside, head up toward KCI, but take a quick exit down I-635 to Kansas. In our rush to head south across the Missouri River, all you probably noticed was the bend of the river channel that brings the Missouri River beneath this bridge. Only a few seconds pass for us to make this journey across the river. You probably paid more attention to the Welcome to Kansas sign than the trees and brush you see on the hillside to the right. But it is in those few seconds that you passed what was once the most vibrant and important sites along the Missouri River to Kansas's development and to our nation's developing history. What we passed in that drive, where the trees now stand, covers the Quindaro town site. Now, what is the Quindaro town site? There you can see the 635 bridge and the area below the Missouri River, and to the right of the left of 635 is all Quindaro. It's a bit more than 70 acres that encompasses the original town plat for Quindaro, as an area of residential development and a cemetery are also included along the way. This area conveys the continuous occupation of the site beyond the meteoric rise and decline of its commercial center. Quindaro developed instantaneously in 1857 on the west bank of the Missouri in what at the time was Kansas territory. Here you can see that cemetery area that I made mention of. And here is the original town plat, showing how it ran along the Missouri River. And in the bottoms area, you could see where settlement occurred. European settlers from northern and eastern states collaborated with members of the Wyandot tribe to establish the first free port along the Missouri River at Quindaro. It provided a strategic location in the struggle to determine whether Kansas, when it finally entered the Union, would be a slave state or a free state. The integrated, multicultural community of residents in Quindaro brought with them strong anti-slavery sentiment, as well as an established history of Underground Railroad participation. Quindaro experienced exponential growth in the first 2 years after its founding, but just as quickly as it grew, the commercial center declined. By the end of the Civil War, the commercial center was all but a ghost town. And then came this phase in Quindaro's history. Town residents, still living in the active residential area above on the bluffs, established Freedmen's University. It later became known as Western University, and it provides significant educational opportunities for African Americans. But is that all of the Quindaro story? Not at all. So why Quindaro? In 1842, denied the lands they'd been promised through treaty in multiple locations, the Wyandots began negotiations to acquire land from the east end of the Delaware Indian Reserve. The next year, the Wyandots reached an agreement to purchase some 23,000 acres from the Delaware in what is now Wyandotte County. The Delaware also gave the Wyandots 3 additional 640-acre sections of land as thanks for their actions to help the Delaware back when they shared homelands in Ohio. This land comprised nearly 39 square miles. It was known as the Wyandotte Purchase, and it covered what is Wyandotte County today. Let's talk about the Underground Railroad in the Quindaro area. The Wyandotte tribe had a history of involvement in the Underground Railroad in Ohio. When Quindaro formed, its settlers soon began to operate Underground Railroad stops. Maps of Kansas Underground Railroad stops from 1857 and 58 identify Quindaro as a station on the Underground Railroad with Walden as the conductor. Now, the Reverend John Walden edited the Quindaro Chindoan. Now, you can see how the flow, enslaved people would be brought across the border here or come down the river here, Quindaro, work their way west, then head up the Lane Trail through free states in an effort to eventually, for many of them, to reach Canada. Slaves escaping from Missouri passed through the small upriver town of Parkville. Founder George Park, also a newspaper publisher, had great sympathy for the abolitionist cause. Residents used numerous ferries to cross between the 2 small river towns. The commercial ferry from Parkville to Quindaro was reputed to be transporting runaway slaves across the river at night when pro-slavery forces sank it in 1861. Clarina Nichols, who you see here, a noted abolitionist and women's rights activist who called Quindaro home at the time, later wrote about the Underground Railroad activity in Quindaro. In an 1882 letter, looking back, she wrote, "My cistern, every brick of it rebuilt in the chimney of my late Wyandotte home, played its part in the drama of freedom. One beautiful evening, late in October 61, as twilight was fading from the bluff, a hurried message came to me from our neighbor. 'You must hide Caroline. 14 slave hunters are camped at the park, her master among them.' Into this cistern, Caroline was lowered with comforters, pillows, and a chair. A wash tub over the trap with the usual appliance of a washroom standing around completed the hiding." Now, while most of the Underground Railroad stations in rural and western territorial areas were isolated and separated by a day's journey, Quindaro appears to have been organized with multiple stations and multiple conductors. This increased the capacity of Quindaro to receive and shelter the influx of formerly enslaved people from Missouri before facilitating their transport to safety inland and north. Now, how do we know so much about Quindaro's Underground Railroad history? Well, it's not just the written word. The Kansas City, Kansas Public Library, one of our Freedom's Frontier partners, has aggressively collected these stories for quite some time and continues to do so to this day. Even though no one is alive now who experienced it, the traditions of oral storytelling among families are so strong, we continue to record to this day those stories that have been passed down. We are hopeful these links throughout the generations tell us more about the lost stories of the Underground Railroad. Not all those who escaped enslavement used Quindaro as a transit point. Archaeologist and anthropologist Jimmy Johnson told the story of his great-grandfather, George Washington, who escaped from slavery by way of Quindaro in January 1862. Near Parkville, he crossed the frozen Missouri on foot. He made it to Quindaro by following pieces of cloth tied to trees by an Underground Railroad conductor. Washington then joined the 1st Regiment of the Kansas Colored Volunteers and fought for the Union in the Civil War. It was the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers were the first organized all-black unit to fight for the Union. The exploding technology of steam railroads soon entered Quindaro. The Missouri Pacific Railroad established a right-of-way parallel to the Missouri in 1860, while Quindaro spent a couple of years outfitting freight wagons. Quindaro's steamboat landing soon came to languish. Quindaro, the thriving commercial town and the first free port in Kansas, was soon abandoned as a commercial area. Ironically, as Quindaro lost its commercial status, it continued to gain population as many recently enslaved people made their homes together in the heights above the former commercial town. The exodusters didn't just settle new towns on the Kansas plains. Quindaro's population went from 4% African American in 1860 to 31% African American by 1870. And you see how rapidly African Americans focused on the importance of education for their future. They founded and developed Freedmen's University. For a time, the Kansas legislature established the Colored Normal School, a teacher's college within Freedmen's University. The university came under the control of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1881 and was then renamed Western University. These are some of the many stories of Quindaro over the next 100 years. There have been strong and substantial efforts to conduct archaeological digs on the Quindaro site. They helped to establish the importance of the truth of the lives lived at Quindaro in the mid-19th century. So how did I become an advocate for Quindaro? How did my organization come to help so many different stakeholders come together and work together to tell Quindaro stories? Well, 3 communities, Native Americans, African Americans, and abolitionists, claimed a portion of the Quindaro story. However, they found it hard to agree on what story to tell. Like a junior high school dance, each group would huddle in their side of the room, not wanting to talk to the others. With 3 decades of bickering over those questions, the National Park Service joined the unified government of Wyandotte County in Kansas City in asking Freedom's Frontier to try to mediate among the partners. After a year of listening sessions, we helped partners agree to 3 things. Collect oral history. These oral histories, in conjunction with the Kansas City, Kansas Public Library, are so important to the families that have called Quindaro home. They wanted to hold a symposium about the importance of Quindaro. We did that in 2018, in April. 500 people attended the keynote, and 200 people attended the 2 days of the symposium. And then they sought an upgrade of the site from the National Register of Historic Places to National Historic Landmark status. Working through all our partners, all the points have been completed or are well on their way. Quindaro is now a national commemorative site. At the same time, we've submitted an extensive application to the National Park Service to request formally the National Historic Landmark status for Quindaro. While the application process can take as much as 4 years to occur, We are confident that Quindaro is on the road to greater national recognition. This is the kind of work that a National Heritage Area does. Take the most significant national stories that make a region unique and work to preserve, share, and celebrate those stories. Now, I bet not many of you have ever heard of Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. One of the reasons is we don't own any property. We don't have a monument that we help bring visitors through and the like. We work through our 165 partners that are historic sites and museums throughout the area. There are a total of 55 national heritage areas. And here's how that all got started. Back in 1984, President Ronald Reagan signed legislation creating the first National Heritage Area. It was called the Illinois and Michigan National Heritage Canal. It tells the story of the 96-mile-long canal that linked the Mississippi River to Lake Michigan. The president extolled establishing a unique public-private partnership that uses grassroots, community-driven approaches to preservation, recreation, heritage tourism, and educational projects in the area. National heritage areas tell important national stories that celebrate our nation's diverse culture and heritage. Not long after the I&M Canal Heritage Area started, Lawrence, Kansas Tourism Director Judy Billings looked for a way to develop heritage tourism in the region more effectively. Knowing about the Illinois and Michigan Canal Heritage Areas, she soon advocated for a territorial Kansas or Bleeding Kansas National Heritage Area. If your eyes are good enough, you can see that's exactly what they intended to call it, right there. In the coming months, hundreds of volunteers from historic sites and museums across eastern Kansas gathered together to work together to develop the new National Heritage Area. Judy recruited a stellar board in support that included U.S. Courts of Appeals Judge Danelle Taha. Judge Taha became the founding chair for the effort. And they worked on writing legislation to create a Bleeding Kansas Heritage Area. So why aren't we called Bleeding Kansas NHA? Well, that's when the Missourians got involved. They argued that the story of the border and civil wars on the western frontier could never be told with only Kansas' side of the story. A larger area on both sides of the border shared in this story, an area that included most of the counties along Missouri's border with Kansas. They reached a compromise. 29 counties in eastern Kansas would be joined with 12 counties in western Missouri to create a new National Heritage Area. But it couldn't be called Bleeding Kansas Heritage Area anymore, so what do we call it? After much review and discussion, they adopted a name not driven by geography, but focusing on the essence of the story in the region. Between 1820 and 1860, this land represented freedom for those living in the East looking for wide open spaces and a chance to start anew. They poured in and through this area as they settled the American West. Between 1854 and 1865, the Civil War started here as America grappled with whether Kansas would be slave or free. The first deaths in that war came along this border. Would it be a free state that emerged, or could it be kept free from Southern invasion? Finally, the fight for freedom did not end with the end of the Civil War. Whether it was the native people displaced by settlement, African Americans looking for a homestead, and the rights that came with that homestead, women looking for their rights, and many more battles over the enduring struggle for freedom, this became the center point for many of those struggles in our nation. The founders settled on Freedom's Frontier for the new heritage area's name. Legislation passed Congress in 2006. Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area joins the now 55 different national heritage areas across the country. Of course, the struggle that was the border war and became the Civil War often seems to be the main theme of Freedom's Frontier. We have more than 160 sites and museums that are our partners, and many of those sites are detailed on the map that I've been handing out to many of you. Please enjoy it and learn and visit some of these sites and see how their stories connect. But Congress said the border and Civil War isn't our only Freedom's Frontier story. Many of our sites also tell the story of the settlement of the frontier. And we also celebrate that enduring struggle for freedom that is represented by dozens of sites, such as Quindaro, the Haskell Cultural Center and Museum in Lawrence, the Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site in Topeka, and the Black Archives of Mid-America here in Kansas City. As I said before, more than 165 sites tell these stories. They join more than 100 other organizations that support heritage tourism and the economic development it brings. That gives us more than 265 partners to Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. Our efforts such as this will not end with Quindaro. Freedom's Frontier NHA is proud of the work we're doing with partners to gain greater recognition for Quindaro. So the next time you head south on 635, remind yourself to take the next exit. Wind your way to the Quindaro Overlook. Take a moment to look down in the Missouri River Valley. Imagine the energy and activity that occurred at this spot. I know it will give you an entirely different perspective. Thank you.
Any questions?
I'm it's a little bit startled by the archaeological site because it makes me wonder, when did the town crumble away to archaeological ruins? How long has it been
So the various buildings in the flatlands down where the current Union Pacific Railroad tracks are, there are approximately 35, 40 sites in that area that were abandoned in the 1870s and 1880s. Quindaro had a Kansas Avenue. It had 2 newspapers, 3 brew houses, 2 hotels, a tannery, all measure of commercial business. At one time, nearly 2,000 people lived in that little area along the river. But the coming of that railroad wiped it out. No stop was put in there or anything like that. And people started filling back up the ridge. And as they established things like the Freedman School and the like, that was all built on high ground to keep it out of the floodplain area. So in the 1980s and the 1990s, as the area was being reviewed for the possibility of putting a landfill there and later a resort, the hand was forced by those who wanted to develop it, to get the area to perform archaeological digs that were done by both KU and K-State students who were involved in the process. And they discovered this wealth of materials. There are literally a ton of relics and materials that are on storage right now in the Kansas State Library that were brought in from the some 30 sites that they dug up. And they believe there are as many as 200 sites in this 100 acres or so that they could explore along the way.
Thank you.
So, Quindaro basically started before Kansas City, and the first water plant was there. They must have had steamboats landing there,
They did.
and then eventually Kansas City had the same thing with Westport landing. I guess it was the railroad connection that really killed Quindaro. But it's weird how something like that can be so vibrant and then just disappear into the woods, and it's gone, and now we're remembering it. And I've heard talk about you guys wanting to do more with the site, and then somebody was the other day was asking me, well, couldn't they have a dock there or a ramp there and do river stuff there too? And so all of that is full of potential.
Most definitely, most definitely. The National Park Service is involved in a project with stakeholders from throughout the community, and there are a number of different groups that are meeting. One of them is looking at the area north of the railroad tracks. This is currently farmland and area that often will flood. All that area, you see the line of the railroad track right running across there. This area right here was where the original Quindaro landing was. Now the river at that time had a much sharper bend. Obviously the Corps has been at work and restructured that along the way. But in this Quindaro Bend area, this is where the landings were, and it was just enough upriver from the slave areas associated with Kansas City being part of Missouri that all the efforts to ship guns and other resources in to make Kansas a free state would bypass Kansas City to land there. In 1857, the New York Times had a series of stories on its front page about Quindaro, the boom town of Kansas. And within a year and a half, the boom went bust with land speculation and the fact that everyone started moving further west.
And technology, the railroad. Technology changes everything.
Yeah. Always has.
As soon as we have those matter transfer booths, well, it'll be a whole nother story.
That's right.
Any other questions? All right, Jim. Well, I want to thank you for sharing the story of Quindaro with us.
Thank you.
And hope you well in your endeavors. And everybody go to freedomsfrontier.org website and read up more about it. And like Jim said, there are a ton of places to visit.
Thank you all very much.